Today we remember 9/11. The world and certainly our lives changed forever 20 years ago. And joining us live in studio is Lieutenant General Reginal Centracchio. Our thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
To set the stage a little bit, 20 years ago, you were the Adjutant General of the Rhode Island National Guard. Before we get into what happened on September 11th, let's talk about what happened 20 years ago today on September 10th.
Exactly this time, 20 years ago, I was standing on the DMZ in Korea with some 40 other veterans celebrating the acknowledgement of the Battle of the Outpost, which was the last several battles of the last 2 years of that particular conflict. And we received a briefing from one of our aides suggesting that there was a lot of chatter, and they were convinced that there was going to be some kind of an activity. We thought it might have been there in Korea. Little did we know it was going to take place in the United States. But several hours after that, we were scheduled to board Korean airline to come back to the United States and land at JFK at 10 o'clock in the morning. Apparently that didn't happen. We did just south of Japan because of a typhoon that put us off a little bit. But bottom line is we came into the United States, we were put down in Minnesota. Didn't know why, couldn't find out why, and no one would talk to us. In fact, they were talking Korean, they wouldn't talk to us in English at all. And I eventually demanded to go up and talk to the captain, which I did, and we were taken off the airplane by the Adjutant General of Minnesota. Little did we know that that's why we were put down. But in the meantime, we did call back home, and we found out from my Assistant Adjutant General, General Reed, that we had been attacked in New York, and that gave us a whole new perspective. It was a tremendous experience, and from that point on, we took a vehicle from Minnesota, drove all the way back to Rhode Island. And I just want to remember one particular thing that will stick in my mind forever. As we were driving north of New York, we looked down and saw the two plumes of smoke still coming out. And that was an eerie, surreal scenario.
Wow.
To see it in person is certainly a different perspective than most of us had. You know, you mentioned there was chatter. A lot came out of this that we've learned, obviously, out of the last 20 years. The Fusion Center is something you had a big role in. Chatter is not unusual, correct?
It is, but when you see that much chatter and you look at where it's coming from, obviously you determine that this now we know better. But back then it was, okay, let's look at something and we determine whether in fact there's a credible amount of intelligence to be able to be acted on. But right after that I got back here, I was appointed as the Homeland Security Advisor, and I was also the Director of Rhode Island EMA, as well as the Adjutant General, Commanding General of the Guard. So I wore several hats. But in the capacity of Homeland Security, I had to go back to Washington and meet personally with President Bush, and that was quite an experience also. When we came back from that, we determined that the best way to share information was to create what is referred to today as a fusion cell, where you have federal agencies, state agencies, multi-agencies that come together, and they determine this chatter could be perhaps looked at as intelligence that had to be either acted upon or dismissed. And that was the beginning of how we started to share information that was coming in from various parts of the world. And consequently, Rhode Island was one of the first to have the Fusion Center, and I was very impressed to see how that still operates today.
We were talking a little bit before the 4 o'clock news started about how it's sort of hard to believe that it's been 20 years. What lessons do you think we've learned in the past 2 decades?
Well, you know, when you, I don't want to make a segue into something we're not talking about right now, but unfortunately, you know, the past 20 years has also opened the door to new conflicts and the way we fight those conflicts and how we gather intelligence. But I think what has changed basically is how we use the military. I personally do not agree that the military should be used as nation-building forces. It should be used to conduct a war, win it, and come home. And unfortunately, I think we've learned a little bit about that to determine that you can't put military personnel into a scenario to hopefully change the culture of another country. Britain learned that you can't do that. Russia learned it, and we, unfortunately, took 20 years to learn that same lesson.
I'm just curious, and maybe it was when you drove past New York and you saw those plumes, but was there a moment, or you remember the moment when you finally stopped and were able to process what was happening? You were so involved in just trying to get information and things rolling.
I think probably it didn't really happen until I reached home, and you know, I met with the governor, and we determined that we would have several meetings, and the first meeting had to do with, okay, what is the impact in Rhode Island? And one of the first things that came out, we would put guards in the National Guard personnel in the airport, And they were determined that there would undoubtedly be an effect on the mobilization of the Guard, and we had to come up with what we're going to do in reference to making that happen, based upon the different assignments that Rhode Island would receive from its federal counterparts. So I think I really came upon what the real scenario was when I started to get all this information and start to look at the reality of putting troops on active duty and send them to war. That was the point that really got my attention.
Lieutenant General Reginal Centracchio, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.